The streets of Lagos never slept, and neither did little Grace. She was 8 years old, maybe 9. She didn't know for sure because no one had ever told her the day she was born. Her clothes were torn and faded, her feet bare and calloused from walking on hot asphalt and broken glass, and her hair was matted into thick knots that hadn't seen a comb in months. But her eyes were different. They were bright and alert, always watching, always searching for something she couldn't name. Grace lived in the shadows of Lekki Phase 1, where the rich built their glass towers and drove their shiny cars, and where people like her were invisible. She slept under the Falomo Bridge at night, curled up on flattened cardboard boxes with other street children who had nowhere else to go. During the day, she wandered through the markets and alleyways, looking for scraps of food, begging for coins, and trying to stay out of trouble. Most people ignored her. Some shouted at her to go away. A few, very few, showed her kindness. A woman selling akara who would slip her a warm bean cake when no one was looking, or an old man who let her sleep outside his shop when the rain came down hard. But kindness was rare in Lagos, and Grace had learned not to expect it. What she had never told anyone, because no one would believe her, was that she could feel things that others couldn't. It started when she was very young, so young that she thought everyone could do it. She would walk past someone in the market and suddenly feel a sharp pain in her chest, even though nothing had touched her. Or she would sit near a woman crying on a bench and feel a heaviness pressing down on her shoulders like invisible hands. At first it frightened her. She thought she was sick or cursed. But over time she began to understand. The pain wasn't hers, it belonged to the people around her. And when she focused, really focused, she could see it too. A faint glow like heat rising from the ground on a hot day would shimmer around certain people. Sometimes it was golden and soft like the warmth of the sun. But other times it was dark and thick, like smoke clinging to their bodies, wrapping around their heads or their hearts or their hands. Grace didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was real. One afternoon, as she sat near the entrance of a busy shopping plaza, picking at a half-eaten meat pie she had found in a trash bin, she felt it again. That strange pull, that invisible thread tugging at her chest, urging her to move. She stood up and followed the feeling, weaving through the crowd of well-dressed shoppers who didn't even glance at her. The pull grew stronger as she walked, leading her toward the back of the plaza, where a security guard stood in front of a tall glass door. Beyond the door, she could see a bright, gleaming hallway lined with marble floors and chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Grace stopped and stared. She had never been inside a place like that before. She knew she wasn't allowed. People like her didn't belong in places like that. But the pull wouldn't let her go. She waited until the security guard turned his head to talk to someone, and then she slipped through the door like a shadow. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold marble floor, and she moved quickly, staying close to the walls, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway opened into a massive event hall filled with people in expensive clothes. Men in sharp suits, women in flowing gowns, and waiters carrying trays of champagne and small, fancy foods that Grace had never tasted. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and the air smelled like perfume and flowers. Grace felt small and dirty and out of place, but she didn't turn back. Because across the room, sitting alone in a high-backed chair near the window, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with smooth brown skin and a tailored white shirt that looked like it cost more than everything Grace had ever owned. But it wasn't his clothes that caught her attention. It was the darkness around him. Thick black smoke curled around his head like a living thing, wrapping tightly around his ears and pressing down on his small shoulders. Grace felt it in her chest, a heavy, suffocating silence that made her want to cry. She took a step closer, and the boy turned his head. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the entire room seemed to disappear. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just stared at her with empty, hollow eyes like someone who had been trapped in a dark room for too long. Grace's hands began to tingle. Hey my people, pause for a second. If you're new here, welcome to the family. This is where we tell real, raw, emotional African stories that will grip your heart and never let go. If you're feeling this story so far, do me a favor, drop a like, hit that subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let's get back to Grace, because what she was about to discover would change everything. She walked toward the boy slowly, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. People around her were talking and laughing, but no one noticed her. It was like she was invisible, just like always. But the boy saw her. He didn't move, he didn't blink. He just watched her with those sad, empty eyes as she came closer and closer until she was standing right in front of him. Grace knelt down so they were at the same height, and she reached out her small, dirty hand. The boy looked at her hand, then back at her face. And then very slowly, he placed his cold, trembling hand in hers. The moment their skin touched, Grace gasped. A wave of silence crashed over her, so powerful and so complete that it felt like the whole world had been swallowed by darkness. She could feel his pain, not just the silence, but the loneliness, the fear, the years of living in a world where no sound ever reached him. She could feel the weight of every doctor's appointment, every failed treatment, every disappointed look from the people who couldn't fix him. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let go. Instead, she closed her eyes and began to hum. It wasn't a song she had learned. It wasn't something anyone had taught her. It was just a sound that rose up from somewhere deep inside her chest, soft and low and gentle. She hummed, and the vibration traveled through her fingers and into the boy's hand. He flinched, his eyes widening in shock. Grace opened her eyes and lifted her other hand, moving it slowly toward his right ear. Her palm grew warm, then hot, and a faint golden glow began to shimmer in the air around her fingers. She whispered, "Let the quiet come out." And then she saw it. Something dark and twisted, coiled deep inside his ear like a parasite. It pulsed with a sickly rhythm, feeding on his silence, keeping him trapped. Grace's hand moved on its own, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the darkness. And just as her fingertips brushed against it, a loud voice shouted from across the room. "Hey, what are you doing to my son?" A tall man in an expensive suit came rushing toward them, his face twisted in anger and fear. Security guards appeared from nowhere, grabbing Grace by her thin arms and pulling her away from the boy. The boy reached out toward her, his mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. Grace struggled against the guards, her heart racing. "Wait," she cried, "I can help him, please just let me." But no one was listening. They dragged her toward the door, her bare feet scraping across the marble floor, and threw her out into the hot Lagos sun. Grace hit the ground hard, her palms stinging from the impact. She looked back at the glass door, tears streaming down her face, and saw the boy standing at the window, staring at her with wide, desperate eyes. Could she really heal him, or had she just made everything worse? The answer would come sooner than she thought, and it would turn her entire world upside down. Grace ran. She ran through the crowded streets of Lekki, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. People shouted at her to watch where she was going as she pushed past them, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The image of the boy's desperate eyes was burned into her mind, and the feeling of that dark, twisted thing inside his ear made her hands shake even now. She had been so close to pulling it out, to setting him free. But they had thrown her out like trash, like she was nothing, like she didn't matter. By the time she reached the Falomo Bridge, the sun was setting and the sky had turned orange and purple. Grace collapsed onto her cardboard bed, breathing hard, her whole body trembling. The other street children were already gathering for the night, sharing stories and scraps of food, but Grace stayed away from them. She needed to be alone. She needed to think. What had she seen inside that boy's ear? What was that thing? And why had her hands grown so warm, so bright when she touched him? Grace curled up on her side and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she drifted off, she saw the boy reaching for her, his mouth open in a silent scream. She had to go back, she had to find a way to help him. But how? They would never let her near him again. Across the city, in a massive white mansion overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, a man named Richard Okafor sat in his study with his head in his hands. Richard was one of the richest men in Lagos, maybe in all of Nigeria. He owned hotels, oil companies, and half the luxury real estate in Lekki. He had everything money could buy: cars, houses, private jets, security teams, but none of it mattered. Because his son, Daniel, had never heard his voice. Daniel had been born deaf. The doctors said it was genetic, irreversible, a cruel twist of fate. Richard had taken him to specialists in London, New York, Dubai, and Tokyo. He had spent millions on surgeries, experimental treatments, and therapies that promised miracles but delivered nothing. And through it all, Daniel had remained silent. Richard loved his son more than anything in the world, but every time he looked into Daniel's empty eyes, he felt like he was failing him. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't make it right. And today, something strange had happened. Richard had been talking to some business partners in the event hall when he noticed a commotion near Daniel's chair. He turned and saw a little street girl kneeling in front of his son, holding his hand, her eyes closed like she was praying. For a second, Richard had been frozen in shock. Who was this child? How had she gotten past security? But then he saw the look on Daniel's face. His son, who never showed emotion, who never reacted to anything, was staring at the girl with wide, desperate eyes. His hand was gripping hers tightly, like he didn't want to let go. And for the first time in 7 years, Richard saw something in his son's face that looked like hope. Then the security guards had grabbed the girl and dragged her away, and Daniel had reached out toward her, his mouth opening in a silent cry that broke Richard's heart all over again. Richard had wanted to stop them, to ask the girl what she was doing, but by the time he reached the door, she was gone. Now, sitting alone in his study, Richard couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? What had she done to make Daniel react like that? He picked up his phone and called his head of security, a stern man named Mr. Benson. "Find that girl," Richard said. "The one from this afternoon. I don't care how long it takes or what you have to do. Find her and bring her to me." Mr. Benson hesitated. "Sir, she was just a street child. She probably ran off." "I don't care," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "Find her now." There was a pause, and then Mr. Benson said, "Yes, sir." Richard hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the dark ocean. He didn't know why, but something told him that little girl was important, that she held the key to something he had been searching for his whole life. And he wasn't going to let her slip away. The next morning, Grace woke up to the sound of shouting. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, and saw 2 men in black suits standing near the bridge, talking to some of the older street children. One of them was holding up a photo and pointing toward Grace's corner. Grace's blood turned cold. They were looking for her. She scrambled to her feet and started to run, but before she could take more than a few steps, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder. "Easy, easy," a deep voice said. "We're not here to hurt you." Grace spun around and found herself staring up at Mr. Benson, the head of security from yesterday. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern face that didn't smile. "Let me go," Grace cried, struggling against his grip. But Mr. Benson didn't let go. Instead, he knelt down so he was at her level and his voice softened. "Listen to me," he said. "Mr. Okafor wants to see you, the boy's father. He's not angry. He just wants to talk." Grace stopped struggling and stared at him, her chest heaving. "Talk about what?" "About what you did to his son," Mr. Benson said. "About how you made him react. He thinks you might be able to help." Grace's mind was racing. Was this a trick? Were they going to arrest her, throw her in jail? But then she remembered Daniel's face, his desperate eyes, the dark thing coiled inside his ear. If there was even a chance she could help him, she had to try. Fam, if you're hooked on this story, do me a favor real quick. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think is going to happen next, and subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Trust me, this story is about to get even crazier. Now, let's see what happens when Grace comes face to face with one of the most powerful men in Lagos. Grace took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I'll go with you." Mr. Benson stood up and gestured toward a black SUV parked at the edge of the road. Grace followed him, her bare feet shuffling nervously on the hot pavement. The other street children watched her go, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity, but no one tried to stop her. As Grace climbed into the back seat of the SUV, she felt that familiar pull again, that invisible thread tugging at her chest, urging her forward. Whatever was about to happen, she knew it was going to change everything. 20 minutes later, the SUV pulled up to the gates of Richard Okafor's mansion. Grace pressed her face against the window, her mouth hanging open in awe. She had never seen a house so big, so white, so perfect. The gates were made of gold-colored metal, and the driveway was lined with tall palm trees and flowers she didn't know the names of. Mr. Benson led her through the front door and into a massive living room with marble floors, leather couches, and a chandelier that looked like it was made of diamonds. Grace felt small and dirty and out of place all over again. And then she saw him. Richard Okafor stood by the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He was tall and broad, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, and even from behind he looked powerful. When he turned around, his eyes locked onto Grace. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard walked toward her slowly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and knelt down so they were at the same height. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. "Grace," she whispered. Richard studied her face, his eyes searching for something. "Grace, I need you to tell me the truth. What did you do to my son yesterday?" Grace swallowed hard. I felt something wrong with him, something dark. I was trying to help." "Help how?" Richard pressed. "What did you see?" Grace hesitated. How could she explain something she didn't even understand herself? But then she looked into Richard's eyes and saw the same desperation she had seen in Daniel's. He wasn't angry, he was scared. "I saw something inside his ear," Grace said quietly. "Something that doesn't belong, something that's keeping him trapped in the silence." Richard's face went pale. "Can you remove it?" Grace's hands began to tingle again and she nodded slowly. "I think so, but I need to touch him again. I need to finish what I started." Richard stood up and turned toward the hallway. "Come with me." He led Grace up a grand staircase and down a long hallway lined with paintings and photographs. At the end of the hall, he stopped in front of a door and knocked gently. "Daniel," he called softly, "there's someone here to see you." The door opened and there he was. Daniel stood in the doorway, staring at Grace with those same wide, desperate eyes. And when he saw her, his face lit up with something that looked like relief. Richard stepped aside, and Grace walked into the room. Daniel reached out and took her hand, just like he had yesterday, and Grace felt that wave of silence crash over her again. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time she was ready. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the warmth flow from her chest down into her hands. "Let's set you free," she whispered. But would her gift be strong enough to break the curse, or would it destroy them both? The truth was about to be revealed, and it was more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Grace stood in Daniel's bedroom, her small hand wrapped around his, and for the first time since she had discovered her gift, she wasn't running away from it. She was running toward it. Daniel's room was enormous, filled with toys he couldn't hear, books he couldn't read aloud, and a television that played silent images on the wall. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the boy standing in front of her, gripping her hand like she was his only hope. Richard stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight with tension. Grace could feel his fear radiating across the room like heat from a fire. "What do you need?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace looked at him, then back at Daniel. "I need you to trust me, and I need him to stay very still." Richard nodded slowly. "Daniel," he said, moving closer to his son and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He spoke slowly, carefully, so Daniel could read his lips. "This girl is going to help you. You need to be brave, okay? Can you do that for me?" Daniel looked at his father, then at Grace, and nodded. Grace took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The warmth started in her chest again, just like it always did, a soft glow that spread through her body like sunlight breaking through clouds. She let it flow down her arms into her hands until her palms felt like they were holding burning coals. But it didn't hurt, it never hurt. She opened her eyes and looked at Daniel. The dark smoke was still there, coiled around his head like a living shadow, thicker and heavier than before. It pulsed with a slow, sickening rhythm, and Grace could feel its weight pressing down on her own chest. This thing, whatever it was, didn't want to leave. Grace lifted her free hand and moved it slowly toward Daniel's right ear. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. His eyes were locked on hers, filled with trust and terror in equal measure. "Let the quiet come out," Grace whispered, just like she had before. And then she reached inside. Her fingers didn't physically enter Daniel's ear. It was something deeper than that, something she couldn't explain. It was like her hand slipped through the surface of his skin and into a place where pain and silence lived together in the dark. She felt it immediately, cold, slippery, alive. The thing wrapped around her fingers like a serpent, trying to pull her deeper, trying to trap her in the silence with Daniel. Grace gasped, her knees buckling, but she didn't let go. "Grace," Richard's voice sounded far away like he was shouting from the other side of a river. "What's happening, Grace?" But Grace couldn't answer. All her focus, all her strength was locked on the thing inside Daniel's ear. She gripped it tighter and began to pull. It fought back. The room seemed to darken, and a low humming sound filled the air, a sound that no one else could hear but Grace. It was the sound of suffering, of years and years of loneliness and isolation compressed into a single note that vibrated through her bones. Daniel's eyes rolled back in his head, and his body went rigid. "Grace, stop," Richard shouted, moving toward them. "You're hurting him." "No," Grace cried, her voice strained. "I'm almost there, don't touch us." Richard froze, his hands trembling at his sides. Grace pulled harder, her entire body shaking with the effort. The thing inside Daniel's ear was resisting with everything it had, clinging to him like it had a right to be there, like it owned him. But Grace was stronger. With one final, desperate tug, she ripped it free. The moment it left Daniel's body, the room exploded with light. Grace fell backward, landing hard on the floor, her hand still clenched around the thing she had pulled out. It writhed in her palm, dark and slick and squirming, pulsing with a faint red glow. For a split second, everyone in the room could see it. A twisted, worm-like creature no bigger than a finger, thrashing against Grace's grip. And then it began to dissolve. The thing let out a high-pitched shriek that only Grace could hear, and then it crumbled into black dust that scattered across the floor and vanished like smoke in the wind. Grace lay on the ground, gasping for breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode. And then she heard it. A sound so small, so fragile, so impossibly beautiful that it made her eyes fill with tears. Daniel was crying. Not silent crying, real crying with sound. He was on his knees, clutching his ears, his mouth open in shock and pain and wonder all at once. Tears streamed down his face, and his whole body trembled as he experienced sound for the first time in his life. Richard rushed to his son's side and pulled him into his arms, his own tears falling freely now. "Daniel," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "Can you hear me? Can you hear me, son?" Daniel looked up at his father, his eyes wide and red, and filled with something that looked like terror and joy mixed together. And then, in a voice so small and shaky it was barely audible, he said, "Dad." Richard let out a sob and held his son tighter, rocking him back and forth. Yes, I'm here, I'm right here." Grace sat up slowly, her whole body aching, and watched them. A smile spread across her face, small and tired but real. She had done it. She had actually done it. Hey, my people, pause for a second because I need you to feel this moment with me. This little girl, who the world threw away, who nobody believed in, just gave a boy the greatest gift anyone could ever receive. If this story is touching your heart, drop a like right now, subscribe to this family, and comment if you're feeling this. We're just getting started. Now let's get back, because Grace's miracle was about to cost her everything. Richard stood up slowly, wiping his eyes, and turned to Grace. For a long moment he just stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and something else, something that looked like fear. "What are you?" he whispered. Grace's smile faded. She stood up on shaky legs and looked down at her hands. They were still tingling, still warm, but the glow was gone. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I've always been able to feel people's pain, and sometimes, if I focus hard enough, I can take it away." Richard took a step closer, his eyes searching her face. "How long have you been able to do this?" "As long as I can remember." "And you've been living on the streets this whole time?" Richard's voice was filled with something that sounded like anger, but not at her, at the world. "Alone." Grace nodded. Richard ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. "You saved my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave him something that all my money, all my power couldn't buy. I owe you everything." Grace didn't know what to say. She had never been owed anything before. "You're not going back to the streets," Richard said firmly. "You're going to stay here with us. I'll make sure you're taken care of, that you have everything you need. Food, clothes, a bed, and education, whatever you want." Grace's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Richard said, and for the first time he smiled. But before Grace could respond, Daniel let out a sharp gasp. Everyone turned to look at him. He was standing now, his hands pressed against his ears, his face twisted in pain. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "There's something else, I can hear it, inside my head, it's talking to me." Richard's face went pale. What are you hearing?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of joy. "It's angry," Daniel whispered. "It's so angry, and it says..." He looked at Grace, his small body trembling. "It says this isn't over." The room went silent. Grace felt a cold shiver run down her spine, and her hands started to tingle again. But this time it wasn't warmth she felt. It was something dark, something watching. Had Grace freed Daniel from the silence, or had she just awakened something far more dangerous? The nightmare was just beginning, and it had her name written all over it. Grace couldn't breathe. Daniel's words hung in the air like poison, and everyone in the room felt it. That sudden shift from joy to terror, from miracle to nightmare. "What do you mean it's talking to you?" Richard asked, his voice tight with fear. He gripped Daniel's shoulders and looked into his eyes. "What is it saying?" Daniel's face was pale, his lips trembling. "I can hear a voice. It's not like yours, Dad, it's wrong. like it's coming from inside my head and outside at the same time. Grace felt her stomach twist. She took a step closer, her hands still tingling with that dark, cold energy. "Daniel, listen to me. What exactly is the voice saying?" Daniel turned to look at her, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "Fear, pure raw fear. It says you took something that didn't belong to you," Daniel whispered. "It says you broke the contract, and now it wants payment." Richard's face went hard. "Contract? What contract? Daniel, you're not making sense." "I don't know," Daniel cried, his voice breaking. "I don't understand it either. But it's angry, Dad. It's so angry, and it keeps saying Grace's name over and over and over." Suddenly, Daniel screamed. He clutched his head and dropped to his knees, his whole body convulsing. His eyes rolled back, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. No, not silent. Grace could hear it. A sound like nails scraping against glass, like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. "Daniel," Richard shouted, dropping to the floor beside his son. "What's happening to him? Grace, do something." But Grace was frozen. Because she could see it now. The dark smoke that had been around Daniel's ears was back, but this time it was everywhere. It wrapped around his entire body like chains, pulsing and writhing and pulling him down, down, down into something Grace couldn't see but could feel. And in the center of the smoke, 2 eyes opened. Red, glowing, furious. They locked onto Grace. "You," a voice hissed, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You dared to break the seal." Grace stumbled backward, her heart racing. "What are you?" The smoke tightened around Daniel, and he let out another scream. Richard was shouting, shaking his son, but nothing was working. Daniel was slipping away, being dragged into the darkness right in front of them. "I am the keeper of debts," the voice said, cold and ancient. "The boy was mine. His silence was the price his bloodline paid for power and wealth. You had no right to interfere." Grace's mind was spinning. "His bloodline, what are you talking about?" The red eyes turned to Richard, who had gone completely still, his face drained of all color. "You know," the voice said to him. "Don't you, Richard Okafor? You know what your father did, what he traded, what he promised." Richard's hands were shaking. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not real, that was just a story, just superstition." "Was it?" the voice mocked. "Then why is your son deaf? Why does your wealth come so easily while others struggle and fail? Why do you win every deal, every contract, every negotiation?" Richard looked like he was going to be sick. Grace stared at him. "What is it talking about? What did your father do?" Richard didn't answer, he couldn't. He just stared at Daniel, tears streaming down his face. The voice laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "His father made a bargain with me 30 years ago. Wealth and success for 3 generations in exchange for one thing: the firstborn son of each generation would be bound in silence until death. The boy was never supposed to hear, never supposed to speak. That was the price." Grace felt rage rising in her chest, hot and fierce. "That's evil, that's cruel. No child should pay for something their grandfather did." "Evil," the voice hissed. "I gave them everything they wanted. I kept my end of the bargain, but you, little healer, you broke it, and now the debt must be repaid." Daniel screamed again, and this time blood began to drip from his ears. "Stop it," Grace shouted. "Leave him alone." "Then take his place," the voice said simply. "Give yourself to me and I will release the boy. Refuse, and I will drag him into the darkness where he belongs." Grace's whole body went cold. Richard looked up at her, his eyes wide with horror. "No, Grace, don't even think about it." But Grace wasn't listening to him. She was looking at Daniel, at this little boy who had done nothing wrong, who had been trapped in silence his whole life because of a deal made before he was even born. She thought about her own life, about all the years she had spent alone and invisible, wandering the streets with no one to care if she lived or died. And she realized something. For the first time in her life, someone needed her, really needed her. And she wasn't going to let him down. Fam, this is the moment. This is where everything changes. If your heart is pounding right now, if you're on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think Grace should do, and subscribe because you do not want to miss the next episode. I'm telling you, what happens next will blow your mind. Now let's see what choice Grace makes, because either way, nothing will ever be the same. Grace took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Okay," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "I'll do it, I'll take his place, just let Daniel go." "No," Richard shouted, grabbing her arm. "Grace, you don't know what you're saying, you don't know what this thing will do to you." But Grace pulled her arm free and looked him in the eyes. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said quietly. "This is my choice." She turned back to the darkness, to those glowing red eyes, and lifted her chin. "I'll give myself to you, but you have to promise that Daniel will be free, completely free. No more curses, no more debts, no more darkness. He gets to live a normal life." The voice was silent for a long moment. Then it said, "You would trade your life for his." "Yes. Even though you owe him nothing, even though his family's wealth was built on suffering." Grace thought about that. And then she said, "He's just a kid, he didn't choose any of this, and neither did I, but I'm choosing now. So yes, I'll trade my life for his." Another long silence. And then the darkness began to move. It unwrapped itself from Daniel's body slowly, like a snake releasing its prey. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, the blood still dripping from his ears but the pain gone from his face. Richard rushed to him, pulling him into his arms, checking him over frantically. The darkness rose up in front of Grace, towering over her, those red eyes burning into her soul. "So be it," the voice said. "The debt is transferred, your life is mine now, little healer, and when I come to collect." The eyes moved closer, until they were inches from Grace's face. "You will wish you had never been born." And then the darkness rushed forward and slammed into Grace's chest like a fist. She screamed. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and blinding. It felt like her insides were being torn apart, like something was burrowing into her bones and wrapping itself around her heart. She fell to the ground, convulsing, her eyes rolling back. The last thing she heard before everything went black was Richard's voice, screaming her name. And then nothing. When Grace opened her eyes, she was lying in a bed. Not her cardboard bed under the bridge, a real bed, soft and warm and clean. For a moment, she thought she had died and gone to heaven. But then she felt it. The weight in her chest, the cold presence coiled around her heart like a sleeping serpent. It was inside her now, waiting, watching. Grace sat up slowly and looked around. She was in a large bedroom, Daniel's bedroom, she realized. Sunlight was streaming through the windows and she could hear birds chirping outside. How long had she been unconscious? The door opened and Richard walked in carrying a tray of food. When he saw her awake, relief flooded his face. "Grace," he said, setting the tray down and rushing to her side. "Thank God, you've been asleep for 2 days. We didn't know if you were going to wake up." Grace looked down at her hands. They looked normal. But she could feel it, the darkness lurking just beneath her skin. "Is Daniel okay?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Richard nodded. "He's fine, he's perfect. His hearing is fully restored and there's no trace of the curse left in him." "You saved him, Grace, you really saved him." Grace smiled weakly. "Good." Richard sat down on the edge of the bed, his face serious. "But what about you? That thing, it's inside you now, isn't it?" Grace nodded slowly. "Yes." "Can you feel it?" "Every second." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then we'll find a way to get it out. I'll hire the best doctors, the best healers, the best spiritual leaders in the world. I'll do whatever it takes." "No," Grace said quietly. "You can't. This isn't something doctors can fix. This is something I have to deal with on my own." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Grace's eyes stopped him. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Grace looked out the window at the bright Lagos sky. And for the first time since she was a little girl, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, chosen, important. Even if it came with a price. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But whatever happens, I'm not going to run from it." But could she truly control the darkness inside her? Or was she already too late? The final battle was coming, and Grace had no idea if she was strong enough to survive it. Grace spent the next 3 days in Richard's mansion, trying to live like a normal child for the first time in her life. She ate 3 meals a day at a real table. She slept in a soft bed with clean sheets. She wore new clothes that didn't have holes or stains. Richard even hired a tutor to teach her how to read and write properly, and Daniel stayed by her side constantly, showing her his toys and teaching her the sounds of things she had never noticed before. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But Grace could feel it growing. The darkness inside her chest was getting stronger every day. At first it had been quiet, just a cold weight pressing against her heart. But now it moved. It whispered. It showed her things in her dreams, terrible things, visions of pain and suffering that made her wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She tried to hide it from Richard and Daniel, tried to smile and pretend everything was fine. But she was running out of time. One morning, Grace woke up and found that her hands were cold. Not just cool, freezing like ice. When she looked down at them, she saw thin black veins crawling under her skin, spreading slowly up her arms like dark roots. She gasped and pulled her sleeves down quickly, her heart racing. It was starting. Grace knew what this meant. The entity inside her was taking over, claiming her body bit by bit. Soon there would be nothing left of her but darkness. She had to do something, but what? She thought about what the voice had said, that she had broken the contract, that she had taken something that didn't belong to her. But Grace didn't believe that. She had freed an innocent child from a curse he never asked for. She had used her gift to heal, not to harm, and if that made her a debtor, then the rules were wrong. And wrong things could be broken. Grace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy streets of Lagos below. Somewhere out there, people were suffering. People with pain she could feel, with wounds she could heal. That was her gift, not to destroy, not to take, but to give. And maybe, just maybe, that was the answer. That afternoon, Grace asked Richard if she could leave the mansion for a few hours. Richard looked at her with concern. "Why, is everything okay?" "I just need some air," Grace said, forcing a smile. "I've been inside for so long, I miss the streets." Richard hesitated, but then he nodded. "Okay, but take Mr. Benson with you, I don't want you going alone." Grace agreed, even though she had no intention of letting Mr. Benson follow her where she was going. She left the mansion and walked through the crowded streets of Lekki, weaving through the markets and alleyways she knew so well. Mr. Benson tried to keep up, but Grace was small and quick, and within minutes she had slipped into the crowd and disappeared. She made her way back to Falomo Bridge, back to the place where she had spent so many nights alone and invisible. The other street children were there, sitting in small groups, sharing food and stories. When they saw Grace, they stared at her like she was a ghost. "Grace," one of the older girls said, her eyes wide. "We thought you were gone. We thought the rich man took you away forever." Grace smiled sadly. "He tried, but I needed to come back just for a little while." She sat down on her old cardboard bed and closed her eyes, letting the sounds and smells of the streets wash over her. And then she felt it, that familiar pull, that invisible thread tugging at her chest. Grace opened her eyes and saw an old woman sitting alone near the edge of the bridge. She was bent over, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in pain. Grace stood up and walked over to her. "Are you okay?" Grace asked gently. The old woman looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "No, child, I've been sick for weeks. The pain, it won't go away." Grace knelt down beside her and placed her hand on the woman's shoulder. Immediately she felt it, a deep, burning pain in the woman's stomach, like something was eating her from the inside. Grace closed her eyes and let the warmth flow from her chest into her hands. But this time something was different. The warmth was fighting against the cold darkness inside her. The two forces clashed like fire and ice, and Grace felt like she was being torn apart from the inside. She gritted her teeth and pushed harder, refusing to let the darkness win. The warmth grew stronger, brighter, hotter, until Grace's hands began to glow with a soft golden light. The old woman gasped as the pain left her body, dissolving like smoke in the wind. She looked down at her stomach in shock, then at Grace, her eyes wide with wonder. "What did you do?" she whispered. Grace didn't answer. She was too focused on what was happening inside her. Because the darkness was shrinking. Every time she healed someone, every time she used her gift to take away pain, the darkness inside her grew weaker. Grace's eyes widened as understanding flooded through her. That was the key. The entity fed on debt, on contracts, on taking. But Grace's gift was the opposite. It was about giving, about sacrifice, about love. And love was stronger than any curse. Hey my people, we're at the final moment. This is it. Grace just figured out how to fight back, and what happens next is going to determine everything. If you've been riding with this story from the beginning, show some love, drop that like, hit subscribe and comment. Grace is unstoppable because she's about to do something incredible. Now let's finish this. Grace stood up, her whole body trembling with energy, and looked around at the street children watching her. "I need your help," she said. They stared at her, confused. "Bring me everyone who's sick," Grace said, her voice urgent. "Everyone who's in pain, everyone who needs healing, bring them all to me. Now." The children didn't understand, but they could hear the desperation in her voice, so they ran. Within an hour, there were dozens of people gathered under the bridge. Sick children, injured men, elderly women with chronic pain, people who had been suffering for years with no hope of relief. Grace moved from person to person, placing her hands on them, letting the warmth flow through her, taking their pain and transforming it into light. With each healing, the darkness inside her shrank a little more. But it was fighting back. The black veins on her arms spread faster, crawling up toward her neck. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. The red eyes appeared in her mind, furious and desperate. "What are you doing?" the voice hissed. "You cannot fight me this way, you are mine." "No," Grace said through gritted teeth. "I was never yours. I gave myself to save Daniel, but I didn't give up who I am, and who I am is a healer." She placed her hands on another person, and more light poured out of her. The darkness screamed. Grace kept going. She healed a woman with a broken leg, a child with a fever, a man who hadn't been able to walk in years. And with each act of love, each moment of selflessness, the light inside her grew stronger. Finally, when the last person had been healed, Grace collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The darkness inside her was small now, weak and trembling. But it was still there. Grace looked down at her hands and saw that the black veins were fading, but they hadn't disappeared completely. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. There was only one thing left to do. She had to heal herself. Grace placed her hands over her own heart and focused all her energy inward. She searched for the darkness, found it coiled around her heart like a dying snake, and wrapped it in light. "You don't belong here," she whispered. "This is my body, my life, my choice, and I choose love." The light exploded inside her. Grace screamed as the darkness was ripped from her chest and expelled from her body in a burst of golden energy that lit up the entire bridge. The entity let out one final, agonized shriek, and then it was gone. Grace fell forward, her hands pressed against the ground, her whole body shaking. But when she looked down at her arms, the black veins were gone. The cold weight in her chest was gone. She was free. 2 weeks later, Grace stood in the living room of Richard's mansion, dressed in a clean yellow dress with her hair braided neatly. Daniel ran up to her and threw his arms around her waist. "You're really staying, right?" he asked, his voice clear and strong. Grace smiled and ruffled his hair. "Yes, I'm really staying." Richard walked over, his eyes warm with gratitude. "You've given us so much, Grace, more than we could ever repay. This is your home now for as long as you want it." Grace looked around at the mansion, at the marble floors and the chandeliers and the luxury she had never dreamed of having. But she also thought about the streets, about the people still suffering out there, still invisible and forgotten. "I want to help more people," Grace said quietly. "Not just Daniel, everyone, all the people who are in pain and have no one to turn to." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we'll build something, a clinic maybe, a place where you can use your gift to heal whoever needs it. I'll fund it and you'll run it." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were happy tears. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," Richard said. "You saved my son, now let's save everyone else." Grace smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't smiled in years. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten. She was seen, she was valued, she was loved. And her gift, the gift that had always made her different, wasn't a curse. It was a blessing. 6 months later, the Grace Healing Centre opened its doors in the heart of Lagos. It was a beautiful building with white walls and open windows, where anyone could walk in and receive care, no matter who they were or where they came from. Grace worked there every day, healing the sick, comforting the suffering, and showing people that they mattered. And every night, when she went back to Richard's mansion and tucked Daniel into bed, she would stand by the window and look out at the city lights. Lagos was still crowded and noisy and forgetful. But now Grace has found her place in it. And she would never be invisible again. Thank you for joining me on Grace's journey, fam. If this story touched your heart, moved your spirit, or made you believe in the power of love and sacrifice, do me one last favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what you loved most about Grace's story, and let me know what kind of stories you want to see next. This is just the beginning. Welcome to the family.